Good Friday. The cross. The way of Jesus, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross. Jesus, who now reaches his last conscious resting place upon the wood of the cross, comes to the end of his journey. From birth to death he has walked in obedience to the Father, and now he is himself the Lamb of sacrifice. And as he accepts the cross at our hands, we also stand beneath it and look up. Without the cross, there would be no Easter. Without the sacrifice, no feast. Without the pain, no joy. Without the crucifixion, no glory. Only 6 days ago, he came into the courts of the Lord to the sound of wild welcome and cheers. Hardly a man but wished him well. The city was in tumult, and his name on every tongue. He followed that by cleansing the temple, sweeping through its courts with the fire of the living God, driving out all the counterfeit dealers. Then he had sat and taught the ordinary people how to please God without being trapped in the two-faced ways of their religious leaders. It had seemed as though the world was at his feet when he took a day's rest with his friends at Bethany. Yet all the time the birds of prey were gathering in secret, and each day he knew what was in the hearts of men, how little they were to be trusted. He knew that he was walking slowly but surely to a cross. Last night we watched and prayed with him. It is only 12 hours since he began his last early days. 16 hours since he celebrated the Pasch with such love and such pain with the disciples. The joy of this close and intimate meal shadowed by coming betrayal, desertion, and the cross itself. To the end, he was our courteous Lord. As he took up the towel and washed the tired feet of his friends, he gave the bread and the cup and shared his very life, so soon to be yielded up for them and for us. He gave Judas a special sign of love, as though he might change his purpose. The mind of love was open to the mind of sin, but found no answer there, and Judas went his way. He had led them to Gethsemane. Through those long hours had wrestled in fearful agony. Jesus, true God, within the capacity of a man's mind, flinched before the choice. The poet sees behind the work of charcoal sketching. Ah, must designer infinite, how must thou char the wood, ere thou canst limn with it? If Satan in those early temptations tried him so hard and so openly, how much more cunningly would he approach him in these last hours, speaking words of wisdom and prudence against the waste and agony of death. How great must have been the human shrinking from betrayal, abandon, physical torture, and death. Have you loved and been betrayed, given and been spurned, struggled and been crushed, fallen and been trodden upon, despaired in a sea of darkness, felt your nerves flexed to explosion, poured out your tears to no avail? Have you cried out to God at the waste and futile pain of dying child and leprous body? Have you wept before the full and sleek, the tight and the mean? Jesus this day was there before you, bearing the world's sorrows. Long ago now it seems, he said, I have a baptism to be baptized with, and how am I straitened? until it be accomplished. Now that baptism is here, and the sweat falls like great drops of blood in facing it. Is there no other way, no other path, save this fear, this crushing load, this failure, this scorn, this hunger, this death? This is the way. This is the bitter valley that he must cross. Yet even as he sets his feet upon the last stages of the way of the cross, it becomes a place of springs, a source of life, reaching from the dawn to the end of time. Here now, as we stand beneath the cross, we see that we cannot shape him to our will. He is not a tool for us to use in politics or war. He is the way, the truth, and the life. We have to struggle, not to mold his body to our cross, but to walk ourselves in freedom in the way of the cross. Look on the face so marked with pain, and the body torn with whips and nails. Look well, for here is not a key to all our problems, but the principle by which we are to live. Unless we have looked long and hard, and have printed his face upon our minds, and his sufferings in our hearts, we will not be strong enough to serve those who, like him, are crushed and thrust aside. Jesus is betrayed at dead of night, as the night wind breathes through the light olive leaves. One friend betrays him, and the others who were prepared to fight are not prepared to suffer, and like shadows they are gone, leaving only Jesus and the guards. Perhaps they may have had some disquiet on their way to execute this duty. Some may have been acting against their consciences, saving their jobs, rather than standing for the truth. Some may have feared some sort of magic power from gossip they heard. Some might have had a desire to defend the temple. All were startled by what they saw and heard, momentarily frightened by the words, "I am he, let these other go." "I am the name of Yahweh" on the lips of a man brought fear into their hearts. It was only momentary, however, and it was soon followed by the travesty of a trial, with the Sanhedrin called out in the middle of the night, all for the purpose of condemning this man. All the plotting of men to condemn the innocent and frustrate Jesus is here, shown in awful clarity, as they struggle to find at least 2 false witnesses. In the end, the high priest felt safe enough to challenge Jesus to declare himself. Caiaphas by now knew his man and was sure he would get from Jesus enough to condemn him for blasphemy. What bitter dramatic irony is here as the Christ, the living God made flesh, stands at the bar of the temple of the living God, condemned already except for formalities, his only protection, the living truth which he is himself. From here, from the rejection and mockery of his own, to the court of the world, the court of Pilate, he too is brought from his bed to hear the case and enjoy the humiliation of the priests. They must beg Roman permission and authority to carry out the death sentence that Jewish law required for blasphemies such as Jesus had uttered. This was not a trumped-up charge. I remember hearing a commentary on a TV program that said that, of course, though Jesus might have been a very holy man, he could never have believed himself to be the Son of God. This would have been total blasphemy for a Jew. That was why Caiaphas forced the statement from Jesus' own mouth. Now he becomes a political ball, passing between the Sanhedrin and the Roman governor, and then between the governor and Herod, the puppet ruler of Judea. Indeed, an old enmity was set aside, and Pilate and Herod made friends over the victim of temple justice. Jesus has been pushed and propelled from one to the other. In his heart is still the sound of the crowing of the cock and Peter's face, in the shadow of the high priest's court. He bears a grief for Peter and for all of us who, like him, in sudden anger or pressure, betray our trust, forget all our fine words, and save our skins for another day. He comes to the final rejection by the people. Pilate has been outwitted by the priests. They have caught him with a smooth but potent threat. Pilate is faced with an inescapable decision. He sees clearly the malice, the desire to do this man to death in their faces and voices. He does not understand the fear they have of Jesus. He believes Jesus to be an innocent man, perhaps a fool, even a visionary at all events, the butt of their hatred. He does not know these men as well as they know him, and so he has Jesus scourged, thinking to satisfy their lust for vengeance, which he perceived but did not understand. After all, he himself was not a Jew, nor needed to know the ins and outs of their theology, except when it affected security, and there they had him, trapped. He brought Jesus out before the people, weakened by the terrible scourging, and thought to have him released by the pity of the crowds, many of whom, after all, thought they had witnessed healing powers or been healed by this strange itinerant preacher. "Behold the man," he said. "Crucify, crucify," they cry. "Why, what evil has he done?" says Pilate, astounded by the venom of the crowd. "Crucify, crucify him, give us Barabbas," they cry. Pilate, as he looks among the crowd, sees the headdresses of the priests everywhere, leading and stirring. In anger and frustration, he cries out, "Shall I crucify your king?" Now Rome does battle with Judea for justice, and Judea and the scheming priest shall pay a price. Back comes the submission. We have no king but Caesar. Pilate has no time to think further. He is near to having a riot on his hands. If he failed to act decisively, he would lose control. He could have said, "I rule for Rome, and Rome rules with justice everywhere. I will not connive at this man's murder." But Rome also expected her rulers to achieve peace and to keep control. This was, after all, only one man, an obstinate man who wouldn't open his mouth to defend himself. It was not, after all, like the crucifixion of the 6,000 at the time of Spartacus. He would have to let them have their way. So, calling for water, he washed his hands of it all. That loaded phrase passes today between men who have no knowledge of that first washing of hands, in front of a howling mob who finally cried, "His blood be on us and on our children." How often in the years since have Christians used that cry as an excuse to persecute the Jews? How often have we, the children of the new covenant, condemned and despised the chosen race, honored with the birth of the Savior of the world? As though the death of Jesus was the responsibility all along of that foolish and fickle crowd that one day hailed him as king and another shouted for his blood. We have all brought Jesus to his cross. He receives it at our hands, and by his steadfast walking through the bitter valley of the cross, he brings his life and makes all suffering through his own a place of springs where death is overcome by life. On the way to the cross, he endures the final mockery, the twisted thorns forced upon his head and brow, the purple robe thrown around him together with sarcastic homage, cruel laughter as he sways in weakness, his mind and body torn, and so, then, they lead him out. It is only in the last 100 years that executions have ceased to be a public example and a public entertainment. People turned out in curiosity, drawn by the fascination of seeing a life cut short, hoping for a spectacle, eager to see how a man would die, looking for a bit of gruesome fun, assuming that they would always be the audience, never the actor. At crucifixions, the watching crowds would expect a bit of spirit from the condemned. The men themselves might well take their minds off what was coming by a cut and thrust banter of bawdy jokes and defiance, keeping it up to the end, resigned to their ill luck in getting caught. Even so, later, one thief would curse and swear, taunting Jesus with what he had heard about his powers. But as Jesus made his way to the cross, it was different. Here was a man still walking after a scourging that often killed the victim. Men have died in our history under the cat o' nine tails, if not from the wounds, then from the terrible shock to the heart. Jesus still walked on, carrying the crossbar of the cross. It didn't seem quite so bad to nail down the shouting, abusive ones. The anger helped. But to nail one down like this fellow, it made men think. The sweat and blood ran down his face and made it difficult to see where he could put his feet. And out of the crowd, before the guards could see what was happening, a woman rang, and with a quick and merciful touch, wiped the face of Jesus, and then she was gone again, never to forget the face she had looked upon in that instant, and whose pain she had eased. Gone, but not forgotten, as we remember down the ages Veronica and her loving pity. Somewhere along the way, too, stood Mary the Mother, in her last loyalty and faith in him, who was both child of her flesh and saviour of her soul. Long years ago, her own mother had trusted her through the mysterious conception and birth of her son. Now she, as mother, gave to him that same trust. There was no conflict in the meeting of their eyes, but perfect agony of love. At last, the work is done. The old soldiers set his body on the wood. Hands and feet are pierced with the skill of many crucifixions. The cross is raised and jolted into place, and faint but clear the soldiers hear the words, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." They shrug and turn to their dice. Now is the covenant in cup and bread ratified, and we approach him here and ever in that sacramental presence. We come to him as on a journey, and our feet stand in many places. In the fields with the shepherds long ago, in the Egyptian desert, where the great Sphinx watched Joseph bring his family down into the land of the Nile, among the shavings in the workshop at Nazareth, among the 5,000 fed on the mountainside, in the upper room at that Passover meal, and finally here beneath the cross on which the Saviour of the world is hung, beneath the cross that seems to reach from earth to heaven. The eyes of compassion are closed by sweat and blood. The hands and feet are arranged by nails to support a broken body. There is a wartime smell of death, the cursing of the soldiers, a terrible sound of crying, and there is coming a darkness on the land. Jesus nailed to the hard wood, mine the will that drove thee there. Jesus stripped in the sight of men, mine the will that shamed thee so. Jesus, suffering the mocking jest, the bitter scorn, mine the thought that caused thee pain. Jesus, forgiving those who knew what they did, I knew, and yet I wronged thee all the more. Break thou our hearts to fill us full of love, for all the world must come to Calvary.